Our next assignment is going to be a study of image composition strategies. It's going to be the fun stuff. Okay, I'm really excited about this part because you guys get an opportunity to explore rendering from a creative perspective rather than just a technical or purely, flat representational style. So this is where we're going to begin to understand how photographers and artists and renderers and painters begin to set up how they lay out the composition of the image that they're creating. So I guess let's start with talking about composition, and then I'll talk about the assignment. So there are a couple of things that you're already introduced to. The two, I would say, most basic methods of composing an image are the rule of thirds and symmetrical composition. So the rule of thirds is really, I didn't draw the lines across it, but I showed you examples of it when it does have the lines drawn across it. But it's really just composing the image in such a way that the focal points of the image, or the objects that your eyes are drawn to, are going to fall on the third lines. That would be horizontally or vertically. So in this case, if we drew third marks across it, top and bottom, and then side and side, the focal point really is about where the guy is kind of grabbing the camera. Okay, and I think what I will do here is drag that into Photoshop and show you. Let's put it in here, and let's grab our crop tool, put it over that. Boom, there you go. There's your rule of thirds. Okay, so the focal point of the image, and it's not the only focal point, okay? So it's not like the focal point has to be exactly on that knuckle, but the balance of the image is focused on that point. That's the idea here. So by this stage, I think you all should be pretty well familiar with that just by, playing around with it. It's almost as if we are so well exposed to this type of image composition that we have a predisposition to compose images that way. And in fact, just about every single one of you set up your images very similarly. The other option, and the other most common one, is symmetrical. So this is a prime example of a very symmetrical image, right? The object just kind of floats in the field, and then everything else that sort of happens around it tends to frame it along the vertical center line of that image. It's very uncommon, I'd say, for the image to be a horizontally centerline centralized image unless you're doing like landscapes and stuff like that, or cityscapes, or you could possibly do like a horizon line that's centerized, I guess. I don't know. There are a few ways of doing it, but it's the less common one for at least, I'd say, kinetic objects. But outside of that, I think you're going to experience a little bit of discomfort trying to set up some more images that are going to create a bit of friction in how you view the image and which parts of the image your eyes are really drawn to. The first of which I'd say is the idea of balancing an image, where it doesn't necessarily follow the rule of thirds, and it's not a symmetrical image. If you think about it in terms of technical alignments, they really don't have that much of a logic at all. However, it feels balanced still. Balancing images are really just a way of trying to both in mass and location in the image, trying to balance the weight of importance from one object to another. So while one object in an image is obviously in focus and it's predominant because it's in the foreground or possibly the background, the image that sort of falls by the wayside and is second most important still has a very prominent position in the image composition itself. Okay, so that's a very significant one, and it's actually used more commonly than you might think. But anyway, so we'll play with that a little bit. But that's one that sort of, if you try to boil it down to a set of variables, it's not that easy to do. It kind of comes through experience and practice and having a good seeing eye for this sort of thing. The other one is leading. And this one I think you're probably extremely familiar with. because we tend to want to graphically compose our designs that sort of have a vanishing point of some sort. Well, that vanishing point really is the focus of the image in one way or another. It doesn't have to be the focus of the image, but really the idea is that you're trying to lead or direct the person through the image to another result. And that's what this one is doing. But this is to an object. We also have framing. So there's a really good movie that I have to show you at some point about framing and all of these things sort of mashed into one. I'll dig it up a little bit later today. But framing is essentially the idea that you're using other objects, potentially even the objects in your render itself, to frame a focal point. And it doesn't have to be symmetrical, it doesn't have to be on the rule of thirds or anything like that. This one happens to be a symmetrical composition. But the other alternative, I think, would be like if there's a landscape. Actually, let me try and find a quick example for you on that. There we go. Something like this is another good example of framing, right? Just using other objects in the actual, I guess, environment, whether it's man-made or natural, in order to accentuate what it is the focus, or whatever the focus is that you're trying to accentuate. So, sorry, go over here. Anyway, so we can use elements like that. Sometimes we will. I don't know that this one is going to be the most frequent that we use, particularly because framing elements makes it a little bit more difficult for us to control how we're representing architecture unless you're doing an interior render. This next one is there's a technical term for this that you should be aware of, but it's a little bit hard to understand. It's called background photography, but I think that it might be more descriptively named objectifying, because really what you're trying to do is you're trying to sort of tear away everything in the background, and you're really objectifying the one object that happens to exist in that space. So we'll explore this through rendering at some point in the next couple weeks, but just be aware that it's one of the more difficult ones to control, I'd say. We also have depth of field, which is sort of, if you think about it, they're sort of correlated, right? Depth of field and background imagery, where you're just kind of blurring everything out behind it, is really just a different gradation of this, okay? I mean, you could do background photography with an actual background, like a black sheet behind it, and that's what you guys do with your models. And we'll use that when we're trying to pull out alpha channels and then create like Photoshop effects and stuff like that. But you need to know how to do this as well, because our buildings do exist in an actual environment, whether it's a digitally made one or a physically made one, and that's why we build site models for our buildings to go on. And you need to really be able to control whether or not we're viewing the site or the cityscape, or if we're viewing the building. Okay, so that's significant. And we also are interested in wide-angle lenses. This might be a little bit harder to see when it's so small. It's not the greatest image in the world. It's kind of low res, but So I very purposefully picked one that's very subtle. But what do you guys notice about it? What's that? Yeah, it's slightly warped. You can see everything. The thing that really leads me, I think, down the road of it being a wide-angle lens is looking at the clouds. Because, well, I mean, in the higher res version of it, you can see that this is a little bit warped, a little better. But the clouds are so wide, and the angle of the clouds here are getting so steep, or basically like they're turning so steep so fast, that sort of draws my eye to it being a wide-angle lens. You've already kind of experienced that. Okay, we know how to change our lens angle, and we know how to get a more dramatic effect. What I think is most important from this point forward to stress to all of you to practice is subtlety. Okay? Because overusing wide-angle lenses is extremely distracting. In fact, I actually just went through an exercise today with a colleague of mine at work who's rather new to representation, and he, made the first mistake of messing with your lenses, is that he went far too extreme, and it was jarring and almost nauseating when you start to move a camera, especially with animation. When you move a camera around a space and everything is kind of like stretching and pulling at the periphery, it's not an enjoyable experience for us as viewers. So, and especially for your jury, should you ever do any animations. So anyway, I want you to practice subtlety with this sort of thing when we get there. And then finally, we have unusual viewpoints. Okay, unusual viewpoints are they're kind of the, well, how do I want to say this? They're sort of like the first crutch that you get on the road to being a creative cinematographer or photographer, right? It's kind of like, if you want to do something that's out of the ordinary, well, what can I do? I can get below something and take a picture of it, from below, facing upward. Or I can get above it and take a picture looking down. It's our first gut reaction to what we feel is artsy. So this is another one that I want you guys to practice subtlety for a multitude of reasons. Because when you start doing unusual viewpoints, what that opens you up to is a whole host of other contextual modeling requirements. Okay, and what I mean is, I should have pulled an image of this ahead of time, but hang on. I mean this. Okay, so I mean the rendering overall isn't the worst rendering in the world. It's very basic and schematic level, so I'm not using this as a great example of rendering. But what I want you to look at is the top left corner. That. Okay, it is absurdly easy to open up windows to other areas of your model, your digital space, your digital world, that you haven't calibrated for that image and you haven't developed enough for it to feel believable. So even while all of this stuff here, down sort of in the bottom, like the trees are okay, this building is kind of terrible, but if we had some contextual mapping that was happening back there, or some contextual modeling, and I couldn't see some blank 26-mile horizon field, then I might be a little bit convinced by this, a little bit. But the second you throw something like that in there, something that's undeveloped and uncalibrated, that's when our brains shut down and we can't get past it. So that's where I don't want you to practice subtlety. I want you to practice vigilance. So, I mean, that's an area where I want you to spend time, is in contextual modeling, especially if you're going to go a little bit extreme on the unusual viewpoint. So, what I mean by unusual viewpoints, if you pull your camera up high enough, then you're looking down on your model, and it sort of isolates the area that you're beginning to render in, or focus on, and that you have to develop. But if you put the camera rather low, don't aim your camera too high, or don't lift your camera up too high, because then that opens up that whole contextual region beyond your model. Okay, so anyway, that's like your first primer to photography and all that stuff. Do you have any questions before we sort of move on? None at all. Nothing? Okay. You're clearly focused on design. Okay. All right. Give me a second and then we'll move on.